Today, I'd like to discuss the subject of gay conversion therapy and its stubborn continued relevancy in the modern Western world. Dr. James Bennett, who was until recently the principal supervisor of a PhD, stood before this very conference when it was held in Auckland in 2019 and discussed the nature of this pernicious practice. And thankfully, there have been developments regarding its legal status in Australia since that time. And while that is something to celebrate, as I hope you'll discover during my talk, it is also sad that the subject has arguably become even more divisive in the intervening years, thanks largely to the Christian right and claims of religious freedoms being impacted. For the uninitiated, we can see from this 2016 billboard the modern form that conversion therapy takes, the glassy, desperate stare of a so-called ex-gay who's encouraging you to look past the scientific evidence of the last 70 years and trust them that change is possible. Much like reprogramming a left-handed person to use their right hand, one can certainly suppress the sexuality that nature has gifted them, if only temporarily. But the key query, and the one that drives my research, is why should they have to? I remember first coming across conversion therapy as an undergraduate in Dr. Bennett's Sex and Scandal course and being surprised that such a thing existed and shocked that it was still practiced to this day. It seemed like a relic from a less enlightened era, a skeleton from a psychiatrist's closet, and would never have guessed that it was something that a same-sex attracted person could be subjected to in 2021, and certainly not by people who claim to encourage love and respect in the name of God. The obvious place to begin my discussion is by answering the question, what is gay conversion therapy? The practice has existed in various forms since the beginning of the 20th century and includes techniques that attempt to change a gay person straight or a homosexual into a heterosexual, to use the cold medical classifications. The procedures can be psychological, such as talk therapy, or physical, such as castration, electroshock, or aversion techniques, such as the ones that Anthony Burgess based several scenes in A Clockwork Orange on. So we can see here in the picture a scene from A Clockwork Orange, and you can see the protagonist Alex has his eyes pinned open and he's being administered drugs to make him feel ill while he's being shown violent and sexual imagery. This is exactly what they did with same-sex attracted men in the early 20th century. They used to administer drugs and show them essentially gay pornography in a hope that every time they saw the sight of a naked man, they would start to feel sick. They can also be either secular or religious, with those up to the 1970s being predominantly medical and including the techniques just mentioned. While after this time and to this day, the practice remains largely the realm of fundamentalist Christians, that is, branches of Christianity that believe that everything in the Bible is literal and immutable. These can consist of programs based on the substance abuse model of Alcoholics Anonymous, but can also reach the extremes of exorcism. So I've got another 1970s film, this time The Exorcist, and it may seem a bit extreme to show this picture, but this is literally what fundamentalist Christians see when they see someone who's same-sex attracted. They see someone possessed by some sort of demon or evil spirit. Irrespective of the format, the title of therapy is highly misleading, as a massive evidence suggests that not only is the practice ineffective, but harmful, leading to depression and suicide. In fact, the United Nations has recently designated it as a form of torture for reasons already made obvious by the examples given. As such, the highly influential American Psychiatric Association prefers to use the designation sexual orientation change efforts. My area of study predominantly focuses on conversion therapy's occurrence in Western countries, including the US, UK, and Australia. However, this is not to imply that it is not present globally. In fact, some American religious groups, including the recently defunct Exodus International, which was the largest ex-gay umbrella organization in the world, have attempted to export the model in recent years to countries such as Uganda. That brings me to the next question to address. Why does conversion therapy remain a relevant topic? In a landmark decision in 1973, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual No. 2. This was in response to growing evidence that not only was conversion therapy damaging, but also that it had a flawed basis. Researchers such as Professor Albert Kinsey and Dr. Evelyn Hooker have shown through significant studies, not only that same-sex attraction was a normal variant of sexuality, but that straight people were psychologically identical to gays, and that being same-sex attracted existed on a sliding scale, with many experiencing bisexuality. Along with widespread protests from pro-gay campaigners, the 1973 redesignation greatly assisted the momentum as the mainstream medical community in the West walked away from conversion therapy. But it was at this moment that fundamentalist Christian churches began to develop their own unregulated methods, which account for the vast majority of cases today. But how significant an issue is conversion therapy in 2021? In the last 4 years in particular, large-scale studies have attempted to quantify the figures of those who have been subjected to the pernicious practice, with UCLL producing the following statistics. They say almost 700,000 Americans have been exposed to conversion therapy, with a further 18,000 set to receive it in the coming years. It is due to this, as well as the fact as these are American numbers and challenges by pro-gay movements and their supporters have driven practice largely underground, you may not think it particularly relevant for us here in Australia. But the lead author of another study, this one also from 2018, but this time Australian, had the following to say. This is from Tim Jones at La Trobe, and he says, the preconception is that conversion therapy is an American thing that was exported to Australia and doesn't exist anymore. Our research shows that this is not the case. If you're in a Protestant church or any other form of conservative religious community, it's likely that that community will be linked into a network in which you'll be able to be referred to someone for conversion therapy. They won't call it that, but the ideas around it are widespread. It is due to this, as well as the fact that fringe psychotherapists continue to offer conversion therapy, that many jurisdictions in the West have initiated or implemented legislation to eliminate the practice. California, New Jersey, and over 20 other US states have some form of legislation either in force or currently being passed to protect people from exposure. So you can see from this map, probably something that you would expect to see. You see that the richer, more educated states in the east and west coast and to the north have some sort of form of protection, but then the sort of central and southern states with less education and less wealth have no forms of protection. It's also worth noting that most of the protection is only against psychotherapists and not religious administration. While here in Australia, the last 12 months has seen legislation passed in the ACT, Queensland and Victoria, with this last piece of legislation including faith-based practices. But as the map suggests, we have a long way to go, and perhaps this is due to Australia's modern history and culture being permeated by deeply Christian roots. This is evidenced by the fact that the Victorian legislation in particular has sparked attacks by pro-conversion therapy advocates who argue that these laws are infringements upon freedoms of speech and the right to practice one's faith independent of the state. One example of this is shown in an editorial from Mark Niles, the leader of the Australian Christian Lobby, and it gives insight in how the religious right attempts to subvert the discussion around Christianity's homophobic past, create a simplistic theological debate. In 2019, the Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews described conversion therapy as bigoted quackery. Iles's response to this is a common one from self-proclaimed conservative groups. He fell back on naming biblical passages, ones which expert historians such as Professor John Boswell describe as ancient Jewish purity laws that have been poorly translated. I'll read directly from Iles's editorial. But what about this? Can a pastor read Romans 1? Can a pastor name sin? Can a pastor preach the reality of being a new creation in Christ? Actually, forget the pastor. Can anyone proclaim these truths? Is the gospel even legal? This takes the price for the most insidious attack on Christians and their churches I have ever seen. So just to clarify, Romans 1 is a passage that refers to same-sex attraction essentially being a sin and something ungodly. And again, John Boswell has basically said, oh, this is a Jewish reference to a Jewish purity law. And one needs to wonder how relevant that is to Australians in the year 2021. This is it. Thus, craftily, the perpetrator has become the victim. But the counter to this is that same-sex attracted people have the right not to feel marginalized and depicted as less desirable, especially as decades of evidence culminating in comprehensive 2009 APA study concludes that the only effective treatment for same-sex attracted people who are dissatisfied with their sexuality is actually just acceptance. We therefore come across the major complication that is present with attempts to eradicate conversion therapy, the blurred line between the scientific and the religious. This is best summarized by the following two quotes. So this is from Jones again, Tim Jones from Tobe again, and he says, the majority of attempts to regulate conversion practices have focused on the regulation of health professionals. However, our study participants confirm that it is highly unlikely that registered medical professionals perform the majority of conversion practice conducted in Australia today. Instead, many practices take place in informal religious settings by unregistered counsellors who are not subjected to the national law or its disciplinary regime. So that's true for all the laws that have been implemented in Australia, except for the one in proposed one in Victoria. And here's another quote from Tom Wade-Souness. He says, by emphasising a definition of homosexuality as a sin rather than a pathology, those seeking to change their sexual desires towards heterosexuality could maintain some legitimacy under the banner of religious freedom. So that's essentially what the argument, the counter-argument it is, that it should be an individual right under their religion to seek conversion therapy. To expand on these points regarding the complexity of attempts to end conversion therapy, I wish to briefly outline the thought processes of religious and secular practitioners through two indicative examples. Though Exodus International is no more, there are many splinter groups that were born from its ex-gay model. One such group wears its influence on its sleeve and is called the Exodus Global Alliance. They're a good representation of Christian right groups in that they depict same-sex attraction as a sickness of the soul and strongly employ choice on the part of the recipient of their brand of therapy. This is displayed in one of the following excerpts. So they say, we believe same-sex attraction are only one of many ways that people experience fallen humanity. Christians and non-Christians can both experience same-sex attractions. For some people, same-sex attraction are unwanted attractions that bring struggle and confusion in their lives. And I've highlighted another section where they say people within the church who experience same-sex attraction may have difficulty finding support in the church or from family members. So it's this idea about it's not the church's fault, it's the individual and their sin. So we're going to, that is Exodus Global Alliance, are going to offer this service on behalf of Christians who are struggling with their sexuality. So as many groups such as this suggest, they're simply offering help to conflicted people of faith. This complicates matters when discussing matters of legality. But what is it that these groups are offering? As noted by Tim Jones, when it comes to the so-called therapy itself, groups like Exodus Global Alliance are generally coy about revealing what they are offering openly. But first-hand accounts from victims in the form of autobiography have given a rise to prominence, have seen a rise to prominence in the last decade. And from these, we can receive an idea of the techniques used. So I'll give a brief excerpt from one example, Gerard Conley's Boy Erased. And this is just, so he says, this is a counsellor who's giving him therapy, conversion therapy. He says, Councillor Schmidt had asked me to think back to a time when my father and I had played sports. Had I felt uncomfortable? Had I received enough masculine affirming touch from my father? Had I sought out love from him that he didn't want to give? So this is just a taste of the pseudo-psychiatric techniques employed, with the outdated Freudian elements prominent, i.e. the absent father and the overbearing mother, and used by unregulated and untrained members of whatever church is providing the service. So the sad fact is that ever since the 1973 removal of homosexuality from the DSM-2, there have been fringe psychotherapists that have made their living off supporting conversion therapy. They see the APA decision on ongoing support as a hijacking by pro-gay lobbyists. One such group is the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity, which is actually an offshoot of NARF by Joseph Nicolosi, who's a prominent pro-gay conversion therapist and a psychologist. He died quite recently. One only has to look at their guiding principles to get a sense of their position. So the Alliance claims there are three guiding principles by which their alliance is driven: client self-determination, so free choice, licensed, trained and ethical therapists, and reliable research and viewpoint diversity in mental health. As with Martin Iles, the perpetrator wishes to paint themselves as the victim. In this case, the Alliance are prey to deniers of what they see as sound evidence and of effectiveness. Unfortunately, the fact that trained professionals tout the efficacy of conversion therapy adds credibility where none exists and helps fuel the rhetoric from the Christian right. Importantly, groups like the Alliance work hand in glove with religious groups, but actively hide their affiliations through their veil of pseudoscience, muddying the debate regarding where theology ends and science begins. In terms of the core mentality of groups such as the Alliance, Dr. Stuart Edser, a Novocastrian psychologist and openly gay Christian, offers a theory. He says, why do some elements of psychiatry continue to do this? Because of their continued discomfort with homosexuality and their refusal to accept the weight of evidence is against the illness model. Their discomfort, some would argue, stems directly from Judeo-Christian roots of Western psychiatry. This certainly offers a provocative suggestion as to why the practice is perpetuated to the current year, and the legislation built to fight conversion therapy, why it will face a protracted struggle. So according to the first volume of Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality, 19th century psychiatry was born from elements of Christianity, with demonic possession becoming illnesses such as schizophrenia and the sin of sodomy becoming homosexuality. However, after almost 150 years, it is now psychiatry informing the religious world. And apart from fringe groups, this message is clear. Conversion therapy is not only ineffective, but harmful. And same-sex attraction is a normal variant of human sexuality. But as I have shown, attempts to end the practice face a thorny and complex path. But there is some light. As can be seen from the following article from October last year, the current Pope has expressed support for same-sex civil unions. While this may not seem significant, this is an important step towards one of the oldest Christian institutions, and certainly the biggest, beginning to accept gay relationships as legitimate. It will also allow a similar change in attitudes and dogma to occur that have been witnessed with things like divorce and single parenthood. This is mainly due to regular Christians willingly accepting the science, as well as opening their hearts to people simply born with a healthy variation of human sexuality. And this leads me to my final point. When Dr. Bennett presented in 2019, he stated the following: if religious dogma is not completely decoupled from scientific discourse about conversion practices, the more likely it is that stigmatization will persist. And with that, less likelihood these practices will ever completely cease. With the debate surrounding the imminent anti-sexual orientation change effort laws in Victoria heating up, and the possibility that other states will follow suit, this statement has only become more relevant. Thank you.